It's an excellent question, and this is where my free enterprise Republican roots will come into play and say we can't obviously tell them what to do. I mean, NBC and ESPN, I work for ABC News, I don't work for ABC Sports. They own those, and they get to choose what they want. And of course, they're making decisions based on viewership, mostly. Having said that, it's similar to the answer I just gave to this young gentleman, that the reality is, if you're a leader, lead. So you own a network, you run the network, you're making the programming decisions. It is a free country. You can do whatever the heck you want. I think we're unanimous on that in this room. But there's also something called responsibility. It's why we see corporations donate money, right? Sponsor events, do all kinds of things for charity. It's just the smart thing to do. You live in a community, you give back to the community. So in the case of a network, and ESPN, actually, I've worked for ESPN over the years. I'm not working for them now, but I've had plenty of contracts with ESPN. I just say that as full disclosure. That ESPN actually does, I think, a good job. Now, Andy has sent me stats, and they continue to come out every few years. SportsCenter, what is it, 2%, right? 1.4% of SportsCenter is female athletes. So I just said they do a good job. I'll explain in a second. So obviously that means 98.6% of the images on SportsCenter, the news stories, whatever, are male. It doesn't shock me that it's a gross difference. It shocks me that it's not 90-10 or 80-20. I bet you if you did it during the week of the Women's Final Four, where ESPN, by the way, televises women's hoops, it would be a little different. Certainly when UConn's in the women's final game or wins the national championship, because Storrs, Connecticut is so close to Bristol, they go crazy over UConn. So I guess that's something. But the reality is, as much as ESPN SportsCenter is not doing a good job on this particular issue, I would say that ESPN programming doesn't do a bad job. Think of all the softball you see on TV. Softball's a great TV sport. ESPN loves it. In the spring, you just go along and you're just searching on ESPN, ESPN2, News, whatever. You will likely, in the course of an April afternoon, or evening, you will see softball. It's because the ratings are good. It's about an hour and a half. Everyone understands it. The athletes are terrific. It's understandable. And guess what? There's no comparison with men. That's the big one. You know, if you think about basketball, right, as much as I think probably everyone in this room would say we wish the WNBA well, right, and we wish women's hoops well. I'm going to be honest with you, obviously someone who cares about women's sports and all kinds of issues, that the visual between the men's game and the women's game is a tough one, isn't it? The biggest female sports backer in this room would have to say it's a different game. That's fine. But when we've got people into, and our culture is increasingly into the video game culture and the dunks and the amazing shots and the top 10 plays and whatever, well, that's men's basketball is going to give you that more than women's. Women's is much more the team game. It's obviously a different game. It's below the rim as opposed to above the rim. Much more passing. I think that's great. I think if you want to show a 5, 6, 7-year-old boy or girl how to learn the game, you watch a woman's game more than a men's, right? But the reality is, for pure entertainment, we're not talking about altruism here, right? We're talking about, I want to be entertained for an hour. You're going to turn on men's hoops. So nonetheless, ESPN does a pretty good job with the WNBA. They have these contracts with all these things. Going back to softball, because there is no comparison in the men's, softball stands on its own. I think women's volleyball, actually, you'll see that every now and then, more often than not, because again, women's volleyball, while the men play, the women's game is just seemingly more interesting. I'm actually shocked that it isn't even a bigger deal on TV, women's volleyball. But there are those pockets. So I'm a positive person at the end of the day. I'm an optimist. And so I absolutely have to say that I think that things are, they're not good, but then you look at statistics like Andy and I were emailing about the London Olympics. I bet everyone in this room watched a little bit of the London Olympics, where for the first time ever there were more women than men on the U.S. team, in part because the men's soccer team, the U.S. men's soccer team, did not qualify. If the men's soccer team had qualified for London, then you would have had more men than women. But for the first time ever, more women than men on the U.S. team. And the gold medals, 63% of U.S. gold medals won at the London Olympics last summer were won by women. So as I joked, if you don't like Title IX, if there's 3 guys hiding under a desk in Montana who still don't like Title IX, but if they watched 1 second of the London Olympics, guess what? You love Title IX, because the women carried the U.S. team. And 63% of the gold medals. Obviously, one of the reasons there is because for women, the Olympics is the Super Bowl, right? Female athletes. It is the World Series. Bonnie Blair might have been a great, a defensive back. Bonnie Blair, the great speed skater from 15, 20 years ago. She might have been a great defensive back, but there's no NFL for women, so therefore Bonnie Blair was a great speed skater and on the cover of SI untold times as she led the U.S. in 3 different Olympic Games. So, but nonetheless, in those Olympics, NBC actually showed more women than men. Makes sense, right? Because women were the stars of the show in many ways. Obviously, you have Phelps and Lochte and whatever. But so there's an example of a positive, and I think most Olympics you will see it being close to even. But the last thought I have on that topic, because this is a business and because they can make their choices, if you love women's sports, and I'm not saying you necessarily are the one to do this, but anyone who loves it, whether it's a dad who loves his daughter's sports, you've got to let ESPN and your local affiliates know that you're out there. Because you know for a fact that if the wrestling scores aren't on the broadcast or aren't on the TV or on the, in the newspaper or online, you know the dad is calling up because the boys' wrestling scores were not in the paper. You just know it partially because for generations, sports is their birthright, right? Boys grew up, especially in the 40s and 50s, and before then, sports is yours, and girls, you stay away. So we just haven't had a chance for the generations to catch up yet. But the reality is, if you're angry, if you love women's sports and you're angry, whether it's the local stations here, whether it's ESPN, you need to shoot them an email. If you don't like the way USA Today covered something, you need to send us emails. You need to be consumers who get angry and say, I'm out here and I care and I want to see more of this. Guaranteed, if that happened, if advertisers, if the people with the tire ads in the paper, if they started hearing from people saying, you know what, that sports section that you're advertising in, I don't like the fact that they're not covering the Alabama women's sports the way they're covering Alabama men's sports. It would change. Because at the end of the day, it's capitalism. It's all about money. So part of it is women just have not opened their mouths over the years to say, I want to see more women's sports, or men who want to see more women's sports. Will that change? I don't think it's going to change for quite a while. But when today's newborn girl is 40 years old, so 40 years from now, you guys can let me know how this turns out. I'd love to be around to see it.